The incident that would shake our entire neighborhood began on an ordinary Saturday morning. The sun was rising slowly, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac, and my wife had gone for her usual walk. For anyone looking in from the outside, it seemed like a peaceful, uneventful community. The kind of neighborhood where families waved politely, lawns were perfectly trimmed, and the biggest complaint was about someone's trash bins being left out too long. But behind that carefully painted facade was an HOA that thrived on intimidation and control. They called themselves the Neighborhood Enforcement Committee, but residents had nicknamed them the HOA Police. They weren't real police, of course, just a group of board members who liked patrol in golf carts, wearing cheap security uniforms and carrying radios. For most homeowners, their antics were little more than an annoyance, warnings about flower colors, threats of fines for minor things. But on that day, their arrogance and self-importance crossed into dangerous territory. As my wife walked down the quiet street, she noticed one of the self-appointed enforcers following her in his cart. At first, she brushed it off, assuming he was making his rounds. But then he stopped, stepped off, and approached her with the swagger of someone desperate to feel powerful. He accused her of trespassing on common property, even though she was only walking along the neighborhood's trail, something every resident had the right to do. But what should have been nothing more than a petty exchange suddenly escalated into something unthinkable. In a moment of reckless bravado, the man pulled a firearm from his belt and pointed at her. It wasn't a toy and it wasn't a bluff. For no reason other than feeding his own ego, he had drawn a weapon on a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong. What the HOA officer didn't know, however, was who exactly he was dealing with. My wife wasn't just another resident. She wasn't just a mother or a neighbor or someone who liked to keep to herself. She was a decorated Delta Force operator, still technically active, though her record and background weren't common knowledge. Years of training, discipline, and real battlefield experience had shaped her into someone who didn't flinch under pressure. So while the man thought he had cornered a helpless target, the reality was very different. She stayed calm, her body language giving away nothing, her mind instantly calculating her options. She knew that escalating the situation could put both her and others in danger, but she also knew she wasn't at the mercy of some wannabe security guard with a badge he had probably bought online. Word of the confrontation spread quickly. A jogger down the street had seen the gun, and within minutes, phones were buzzing with messages about what had happened. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. The HOA police had actually pulled a gun on someone. For years, their behavior had been tolerated, even excused, but now it had crossed into something no one could ignore. When my wife returned home, she was collected, but I could see the storm behind her eyes. She wasn't shaken because of fear. She was furious at the recklessness, at the sheer stupidity of someone putting lives in danger over nothing. For her, the fight was no longer just about being disrespected. It was about principle. She knew better than anyone that people who misuse power needed to be held accountable. And if the HOA thought they could sweep this under the rug, they had no idea what was about to hit them. That night, as I looked out at the street, I noticed the HOA patrol cart slowly cruising again, the same man sitting in it, smug and untouchable, as if he hadn't just pulled a gun on a neighbor. But he had no idea his actions had sparked something far bigger than he could control. Because my wife wasn't just another resident in his subdivision. She was someone who had taken down real threats in far darker places than a gated neighborhood. And now, with the community behind her and the truth ready to come out, the so-called HOA police were about to find out exactly what it meant to pick the wrong fight perfect. The fallout from that reckless moment spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning, nearly everyone in the neighborhood had heard some version of the story. Some whispered about it at the community pool. Others debated it loudly over their morning coffee, and a few shook their heads in disbelief as they trimmed their hedges. But no matter how the details shifted in retelling, the core fact remained the same. One of the HOA police had pulled a gun on a resident. The board, of course, tried to downplay it immediately. A carefully worded email went out to all homeowners, claiming the incident was a misunderstanding. They painted the so-called officer as someone concerned for neighborhood safety, and my wife as a resident who had been uncooperative. The language was clearly designed to soften the truth, but it had the opposite effect. People were furious. Not just at what happened, but at the insult of being treated like fools who couldn't see through a cover-up. What the board didn't count on was that my wife wasn't the type to sit quietly and let them rewrite reality. She began gathering statements from witnesses, starting with the jogger who had seen the gun, and moving to others who had heard about it firsthand. She collected everything, messages, screenshots, even timestamps from security cameras mounted on nearby homes. It wasn't just evidence. It was a case being built piece by piece. And while she worked, she also carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had faced far worse than a neighborhood bully with a firearm. She didn't brag about her background. She didn't tell anyone who she really was. But her demeanor, her quiet intensity, made people lean in when she spoke. Neighbors who had once been afraid of the HOA suddenly began stepping forward. They were tired of the harassment, the bogus fines, the constant threats. My wife became the person they rallied behind, the one who finally gave them a reason to speak up. It was during the next HOA meeting that the shift truly became impossible to ignore. The clubhouse was packed, far more than usual, with residents crammed into every seat, standing in the back, even spilling out into the hallway. The board president tried to start things off with the usual bland updates, but the room bristled with impatience. When the gun incident was mentioned only briefly, as a safety misunderstanding, the tension snapped. Residents began raising their voices, demanding answers. Why had the HOA police been carrying firearms in the first place? Who gave them the authority to patrol with weapons? And why was there no accountability for what had happened? The board, used to controlling the room with scripted responses, found themselves drowning under the weight of the anger pressing in on them. My wife sat quietly, letting the crowd do the work, but every so often she would interject with a simple fact, calmly delivered, undeniable, impossible to ignore. She had the witnesses. She had the evidence. She knew how to dismantle their lies one sentence at a time. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their rehearsed explanations unraveling under the scrutiny. But behind the panic on their faces, there was also arrogance. They believed they could weather the storm. They believed that once the meeting ended, people would go home, simmer down, and life would return to the usual cycle of complaints and fines. What they didn't realize was that the neighborhood had changed. The fear that once kept residents quiet had cracked. My wife hadn't just exposed one man's recklessness. She had exposed the entire system's rot. That night, after the meeting finally broke down in chaos, whispers spread of organizing something larger. Neighbors were talking about petitions, about demanding resignations, even about involving law enforcement. The once untouchable HOA police were suddenly the subject of ridicule and suspicion. The man who had pulled the gun still strutted around like nothing had happened, but the smirk on his face was thinner now, almost forced. He could feel the shift. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, the conversations that stopped when he walked past. For the first time, he wasn't the one holding power. It was slipping away and fast. And as my wife watched the unraveling from our front porch, arms crossed and expression steady, she knew exactly what came next. The board thought they were skilled at playing politics, but they had never gone up against someone like her. Someone who had spent her life navigating chaos, dismantling threats, and winning battles far bigger than this suburban war. The HOA believed they could bury the truth. Instead, they had awakened a storm that was about to tear through their entire foundation. The HOA meeting that followed the armed confrontation was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. People packed into the clubhouse, whispering nervously, their eyes darting between the board members and the family they had targeted. The air was tense, thick with suspicion and fear. The image of a so-called HOA police officer pulling a weapon on a resident's wife had spread like wildfire, not just around community, but also across social media. Video snippets, posted by bystanders, had already gone viral, sparking outrage far beyond the small neighborhood. The board members sat stiffly at the long table in front, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Their chosen enforcer, the self-proclaimed HOA police who had drawn the weapon, was noticeably absent. No one knew where he had gone, though rumors suggested he was being questioned by authorities. What most residents didn't know was that the wife he had threatened was not only trained but also active Delta Force. Her poise and calm had shocked everyone who saw the footage, and many wondered just how much danger the HOA had unleashed by provoking her. As the meeting dragged on, more residents stood to speak. They described years of overreach, intimidation, and harassment. Stories poured out about sudden fines, secret surveillance patrols, and fabricated rules meant to squeeze money from homeowners. For the first time, people were uniting against the board. No one wanted to be next on the hit list of their so-called HOA police. The image of a gun pointed at a homeowner's wife had crossed every imaginable line. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, law enforcement had already been investigating. The HOA's use of an unauthorized enforcer, the hidden funds collected from arbitrary fines, and the pattern of harassment all painted a picture of corruption. The board's arrogance had left a paper trail, and it was unraveling quickly. What truly sealed their downfall was the testimony of the Delta Force wife herself. She gave a detailed account of the incident, calm and precise, her military background lending weight to every word. Investigators couldn't dismiss her. Within weeks, charges were filed. The so-called HOA police officer faced serious consequences for brandishing a firearm without justification. The board members themselves were not spared. Accusations of fraud, misuse of funds, and criminal intimidation began stacking up. One by one, resignations poured in, though it was too late to save their reputations. This was only the beginning.